Workers of the world, let us begin with a truth so sharp it cuts through every illusion. The world you wake up. In each morning its factories, its cities, its wealth, its movement exists only because you keep it alive. And the moment the working class chooses to fold its arms, the wheels of capitalism grind to a halt. The masters of capital tremble not at the laws they write nor the police they fund. They tremble at the day the worker remembers the strength of their own hands. For the greatest secret of this system is this: those who appear powerless hold the very power that keeps the world turning. But capitalism thrives precisely because it convinces the worker to forget this truth. It buries clarity beneath the noise of ideology, teaching you to see your exploitation as natural, your suffering as personal failure, your alienation as the order of things. The owners of capital write history as if they alone create. They describe wealth as their gift to civilization, when in reality, every building raised, every road laid, every machine operated, every service delivered is the direct result of your labor. The wealth of the few is nothing but the accumulated, unpaid toil of the many. Marx showed us how capitalism transforms living human effort into a commodity sold on the market. Your energy, your creativity, your hours measured, bought, and consumed like fuel. You are reduced not to a person but to labor power, a quantity the capitalist must cheapen to expand profit. Thus, exploitation is not a moral flaw, it is the mathematical engine of the system. The more you produce, the richer they grow, and the poorer you become in comparison. Capital grows only by devouring the worker. Study any factory floor, any corporate office, any logistical network, and you will find the same structure marked. Dissected in capital, those who labor do not control the product, the process, or the conditions of work. The more essential you are, the less power the system allows you to possess. The capitalist commands not because of genius, but because of ownership of things you operate, improve, and sustain. Their authority is nothing but property masquerading as leadership. And yet, the ruling class insists that order depends on them. They claim society collapses without their innovation, their entrepreneurship, their guidance. But history proves the opposite. When the workers withdraw their labor, society stops. When the capitalists withdraw their capital, society adapts. Machines do not run because a billionaire gives permission, they run because a worker turns the key. Still, the system survives by dividing those who share the same chains. Marx warned repeatedly that the ruling class maintains power not only through economic exploitation, but through the shaping of consciousness. They weaponize nationality, religion, race, language, gender, and occupation, turning the oppressed against one another, so that no one turns against the oppressor. The ideology of capitalism enters the schools, the news, the workplaces, teaching you that division is natural, that competition is inevitable, that the suffering of your neighbor is unrelated to your own. A divided working class protects the ruling class more effectively than any army. But once workers understand that their struggles are shared, that their exploitation has a single source, that their liberation is bound together, they become unstoppable. Class consciousness is not merely awareness. It is the spark that ignites transformation. It is what Marx called the moment when the class in itself becomes the class for itself, when workers cease themselves as isolated individuals and recognize themselves as a collective force capable of reshaping history. And this force is not theoretical. It is real, material, and poised beneath the surface of everyday life. Every strike reveals it. Every protest exposes it. Every movement of solidarity demonstrates that the ruling class owns property. But the working class owns power. The ability to stop production, to interrupt circulation, to disrupt the economic bloodstream of society. This is the power no capitalist can buy, legislate, or suppress indefinitely. But power unused is power surrendered. To transform society, workers must organize not as scattered voices, but as a united class with shared purpose. Marx never envisioned change emerging from spontaneous outrage alone. He taught that liberation requires structure, discipline, theory, and collective strategy. It requires workers' organizations, unions, councils, parties, and movements rooted in the material conditions of their lives. It demands the courage to confront not only the symptoms of oppression, but the system that manufactures them. And above all, It requires the will to imagine a world beyond exploitation. Marx insisted that capitalism is not the final form of human society. It is a temporary, historical stage born out of feudalism and destined to be overcome by the very class it exploits. The working class, precisely because it is stripped of ownership, becomes the universal class, the only force capable of building a society where wealth is shared, labor is dignified, and human development replaces profit as the measure of progress. Never forget, you are not fighting for crumbs from the table. You are fighting for control of the table itself. You are not asking for relief from oppression. You are fighting to abolish the conditions that make oppression possible. You are not seeking permission from those who benefit from your exploitation. You are asserting the right to determine your own destiny. The world the capitalists have built is unsustainable, unequal, and rooted in the suppression of human potential. But the world the workers can build, organized, conscious, unified, is one where freedom is not a slogan but a lived reality. One where production serves human need, not private profit. One where the collective power of humanity is no longer harnessed to enrich a minority but is unleashed to elevate all. And so I say to you, never forget that the working class has the power to stop the world and the power to start a new one. The ruling class hopes you remain isolated, silent and unaware. But the moment workers stand together, aware of their role in history, aware of the source of their exploitation, aware of their collective power, the system trembles. The future does not belong to those who hoard wealth. It belongs to those who create it. The future does not belong to the few. It belongs to the many. The future belongs to the working class once it remembers its power, organizes its ranks, and claims its rightful place as the force that can transform society from the foundations upward. The world is waiting for you to rise. The working class sustains all production and holds the real power to halt or transform society, a truth that becomes unmistakably clear the moment one looks beneath the surface of daily life and examines how the modern world actually functions. Every object we use, every service we rely upon, every ounce of wealth that circulates through the veins of the global economy exists because workers create it, transport it, maintain it, and reproduce the conditions for its continued creation. The capitalist may claim ownership, but ownership alone produces nothing. It is labor that shapes raw material in value, that animates machines, that keeps cities breathing, that ensures society itself continues to function. Without the worker, production ceases, markets collapse, circulation freezes, and the supposed masters of the economy are revealed as entirely dependent on the very people they seek to control. Marx emphasized this repeatedly. The working class is the living engine of history, the class whose collective effort constitutes the foundation of all social wealth and development. Yet despite bearing this immense responsibility, the worker is alienated from both the product of their labor and the power their labor contains. They are taught to see themselves as small participants in a vast system, each performing isolated tasks without recognition of the broader totality they sustain. Capitalism deliberately fragments the labor process so that workers do not see how indispensable they truly are, how every movement of capital rests upon the muscles, minds, and cooperation of millions whose contributions are systematically undervalued. What appears as the natural functioning of society is in fact the coordinated labor of the working class, operating under conditions imposed by those who do not labor themselves. Once this veil is lifted, once workers recognize that they are not marginal but central, not replaceable, but essential, the hierarchy that capitalism depends upon loses its ideological legitimacy. The power of the working class lies not only in its role in producing goods, but also in its control over the processes that keep society running. Transportation networks, energy grids, communication systems, health services, education, sanitation, agriculture, and manufacturing all rely on workers who possess the skills, knowledge, and practical command necessary to operate them. If these workers withdraw their labor in unison, if they collectively decide that the system no longer serves their interests, everything stops. The ports fall silent, the factories go dark, the trains idle on the track, and the flow of profit that capitalists depend upon evaporates instantly. History has shown time and again that the most decisive force capable of shaking societies to their core is not the will of elites, but the coordinated action of workers who recognize the leverage they inherently possess. The strike is not merely a tactic, it is a demonstration of structural power, a reminder that production continues only with the consent and participation of those who produce. This power, however, remains dormant when workers see themselves as isolated individuals, each struggling merely to survive. Capitalism depends on this fragmentation, fostering competition among workers to weaken their unity and obscure their shared interests. But beneath these divisions lies a fundamental truth: no worker, regardless of industry or nation, can escape the conditions of exploitation that define wage labor. Recognizing this shared condition allows workers to understand that their power extends beyond the shop floor or office cubicle. It is a power rooted in numbers, in indispensability, and in the collective capacity to reorganize society according to human need rather than private profit. When workers realize they are the ones who produce everything, they also realize they are capable of producing a different world entirely. The working class does not need to seize power from a position of weakness. It already possesses the latent strength to remake society. The moment workers understand that capital cannot function without them, that the ruling class contributes nothing to the actual process of production, the balance of power begins to shift. Workers become aware that they are not merely sustaining the world as it is, but are capable of shaping the world as it could be. Everything the capitalist system claims as its achievement is in fact the collective labor of millions who receive only a fraction of the wealth they generate. To transform society, workers need only act together, recognizing that the same power that can stop the world can also start it anew according to principles of justice, equality, and shared prosperity. Capitalism survives by exploiting labor and shaping consciousness to conceal that exploitation, a dual mechanism that ensures not only the extraction of surplus value from the worker, but also the creation of a worldview that normalizes and justifies this extraction. At the core of the capitalist mode of production lies a simple yet devastating relation. The worker sells their labor power for a wage that never equals the full value they create, while the capitalist appropriates the surplus as profit. This is not an accident or a moral failing of individual employers, but a structural necessity of the system itself. If the worker were compensated fully for what they produce, profit would vanish, and with it the very engine of capitalist accumulation. Thus, exploitation is embedded in every transaction between worker and capitalist, hidden beneath the appearance of free exchange. The wage form disguises the extraction taking place, giving the impression that the worker is paid for the entirety of their labor rather than only for the portion necessary to keep them alive and able to return to work. Yet, exploitation alone cannot secure the stability of the system. For capitalism to endure, workers must not see themselves as exploited. They must instead internalize the logic of the market, believing that their conditions are natural, deserved, or unchangeable. This is where the shaping of consciousness becomes essential. From early childhood through the institutions of school, media, religion, workplace discipline, and cultural narrative, individuals are taught to view capitalism as synonymous with freedom, progress, and rational order. They learn to see competition as human nature, inequality as inevitable, and the pursuit of profit as the defining measure of success. In this ideological environment, exploitation becomes nearly invisible. The worker, taught to identify with the dream of upward mobility, often blames themselves for economic hardship rather than the system structured to produce hardship for the many and abundance for the few. This shaping of consciousness extends deeply into everyday life, influencing how people perceive, value, work, and even their own sense of self. Workers are encouraged to see labor not as a social relation, but as a personal choice, a matter of individual responsibility. If they struggle, they are told it is because they lack skills, discipline, or ambition, not because the system demands a class of exploited laborers to maintain accumulation. The capitalist system thus transforms structural exploitation into a narrative of personal failure, deflecting anger away from the ruling class and turning it inward or toward other workers. This manipulation is reinforced by consumer culture, which promises fulfillment through the purchase of commodities while masking the labor that produced them. The worker becomes both the producer of goods and the consumer who buys back fragments of their own. Stolen labor in the form of commodities that offer temporary satisfaction but never liberation. Capitalism's ideological power also works by fragmenting the working class, encouraging competition among workers so that they see each other rather than capital as the source of their difficulties. Nationalism, racism, sexism, and various forms of identity-based division are all strategic, amplified to prevent workers from recognizing their shared exploitation. The ruling class benefits immensely from a working population divided by superficial difference, each group struggling separately rather than uniting to challenge the system as a whole. By shaping consciousness in this way, capitalism ensures that its victims become unwitting defenders of the very structures that oppress them. Workers are encouraged to aspire to become capitalists themselves, to see exploitation not as a crime but as a ladder of opportunity, even though only a minuscule fraction ever escape their class position. The system also shapes consciousness through the illusion of choice and freedom. Workers may be free to choose their employer, but they are not free to choose whether they must sell their labor power to survive. This coerced freedom is presented as genuine autonomy, masking the fundamental compulsion at the heart of capitalist society. Even democratic institutions are influenced by the power of capital, shaping political consciousness in ways that keep economic power unchallenged. Elections may change faces, but the structure of exploitation remains untouched because consciousness is shaped to perceive political change without economic transformation as sufficient. Despite these mechanisms, cracks in the ideological armor appear whenever workers experience conditions that contradict the dominant narrative. When wages stagnate while corporate profits soar, when debt becomes a permanent condition of life, when the promise of upward mobility collapses, workers begin to question the stories they were taught. In these moments, the ideological veil weakens, and class consciousness can emerge, revealing the reality that capitalism survives not through fairness or freedom but by exploiting labor and shaping thought to legitimize that exploitation. The system endures only as long as workers remain unaware of their collective power and the true nature of the forces that govern their lives. Division among workers is the ruling class's strongest weapon to maintain control, a strategy that has been refined across centuries to ensure that those who share the same chains never join together to break them. Capitalism depends not only on extracting surplus from labor, but on preventing workers from recognizing their shared interests and collective power. The ruling class understands that a united working class possesses the capacity to disrupt production, challenge property relations, and transform society at its roots. Therefore, they cultivate division as deliberately as they cultivate profit, knowing that fragmentation weakens the very force capable of overturning their dominance. This strategy is not accidental or peripheral. It is central to the maintenance of class rule woven into law, institutions, cultural norms, and daily interactions that shape how workers see themselves and one another. Throughout history, ruling classes have employed division to prevent solidarity, splitting workers along lines of nationality, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, language, skill level, and even employment status. Each division serves the same purpose: to ensure that workers perceive themselves as competing groups rather than a collective class with shared exploitation. When workers are conditioned to see each other as rivals for scarce resources, jobs, or recognition, they become less likely to unite against the real source of their oppression. The ruling class benefits from this fragmentation because it redirects anger horizontally rather than vertically. Instead of confronting the exploiters who control the economy, workers blame one another for unemployment, low wages, cramped living conditions, and social insecurity. In this way, division acts as a shield that protects the ruling class from the consequences of its own policies and economic interests. Capital exploits these divisions through economic structures that reinforce inequality among workers. Differential wages, segmented labor markets, and hierarchical job roles are used to create artificial distinctions that mask the reality of shared exploitation. Skilled workers are often encouraged to see themselves as superior to unskilled workers, men as superior to women, citizens as superior to migrant workers, and permanent employees as superior to temporary or precarious workers. These hierarchies do not reflect intrinsic differences in worth or ability. They reflect deliberate strategies to break the bonds of solidarity. By convincing certain groups of workers that they have more in common with the capitalist than with fellow workers of a different identity or status, the ruling class secures compliance and undermines class unity. This tactic ensures that even when exploitation is evident, workers hesitate to act collectively because they have internalized the belief that their fellow workers are competitors or threats, not allies. Ideology plays a crucial role in sustaining these divisions. Media, education, and cultural institutions constantly reinforce narratives that highlight differences and obscure commonalities. Workers are encouraged to define themselves primarily through identity categories rather than through their relationship to production. While identities are real and meaningful in many ways, capitalism weaponizes them to create antagonisms that overshadow the fundamental antagonism between labor and capital. When workers are taught to fear or mistrust one another based on constructed social categories, they become less capable of recognizing the deeper unity that arises from their common exploitation. This ideological fragmentation ensures that even in moments of crisis, workers often mobilize separately rather than collectively, reducing the effectiveness of their resistance. The ruling class also uses division to discipline the working class. When workers see others as threats to their economic survival, they are more likely to accept lower wages, harsher conditions, and increased exploitation out of fear that someone else will take their place. This manufactured competition benefits employers who use the presence of divided labor forces to suppress demands and weaken unions. A workforce fragmented by prejudice, mistrust, or competition is easier to control, easier to replace, and easier to exploit. The stability of capitalist production depends on this fragmentation. Without it, workers might recognize the immense structural power they hold when united. Despite these efforts, the potential for unity remains latent in the shared experiences of exploitation. When workers begin to see that their struggles, whether economic, social, or cultural, are rooted in the same system that benefits the ruling class, the divisions lose much of their power. Solidarity becomes possible when workers realize that the hierarchy imposed upon them are artificial tools designed to maintain control. As class consciousness develops, workers start recognizing that the worker from another nation, another gender, another race, or another occupation is not their enemy but their comrade in a common struggle against exploitation. The ruling class fears this recognition because it undermines the very mechanism that protects their dominance. Division among workers is effective only as long as workers remain unaware of its purpose. Once they understand that these divisions serve the interests of the ruling class, they can begin to transcend them, forging unity out of shared material conditions. A united working class possesses a power that no ruling class can withstand, for solidarity transforms isolated grievances into collective strength, capable of challenging the foundations of capitalist society. Class consciousness turns isolated individuals into a united, revolutionary force by transforming the worker's understanding of their position in society from a personal experience into a collective reality. Under capitalism, every worker begins as an isolated individual confronting the pressures of survival alone, believing that their struggle, low wages, long hours, insecurity, alienation are unique burdens they must somehow overcome through personal effort or luck. This isolation is not accidental. It is a structural condition produced by the capitalist system which thrives when workers see themselves as separate units rather than members of a single class bound by common exploitation. But when consciousness shifts, when workers come to understand that their individual hardships are symptoms of a broader system that affects millions like them, their experience ceases to be private and becomes political. They begin to see that their problems cannot be solved individually because they are created collectively, and therefore must be confronted collectively. Marx described this transformation as the moment when a class in itself becomes a class for itself. A class in itself exists objectively. Workers sell labor power, produce surplus value, and remain exploited regardless of whether they realize it. But a class for itself arises only when workers recognize their shared interests and begin to act together to defend them. This shift in consciousness is revolutionary, because it replaces the ideology of competition with the reality of solidarity. Workers stop seeing each other as rivals and start seeing one another as allies in a struggle against exploitation. Instead of internalizing the capitalist narrative that pits individual against individual, they begin to identify the true source of their oppression and direct their resistance upward rather than sideways. Class consciousness also reveals the structural nature of exploitation. Workers begin to understand that capitalism is not a neutral system, but a historical mode of production rooted in the extraction of surplus value. They see that the capitalist profit depends entirely on paying workers less than the value they create, and that this exploitation shapes every institution and ideology of society. With this understanding, the illusions that once obscured their exploitation, meritocracy, personal responsibility, individual success, lose their power. The worker no longer blames themselves for their struggles, but recognizes that the system is designed to produce their insecurity while enriching a minority. This clarity liberates the worker from the psychological grip of capitalist ideology and opens the door to collective action. As class consciousness expands, workers begin to perceive their collective power with unprecedented clarity. They realize that they are the ones who produce all wealth, operate all machinery, maintain all infrastructure, and make society function in every meaningful way. The recognition that the ruling class depends entirely on their labor is a profound source of empowerment. It shows the worker that they are not powerless but necessary, not marginal but central, not replaceable but indispensable. This awareness transforms fear into confidence, resignation into resolve, and isolation into solidarity. When workers understand that the system cannot function without them, they also understand that they possess the latent power to challenge, disrupt, or overturn it entirely. Class consciousness also strengthens the capacity for organization. A worker acting alone can resist only in limited ways, but a class acting together can reshape history. Consciousness enables workers to build unions, movements, councils, and parties capable of coordinating their collective strength. It creates networks of trust, shared purpose, and strategic coherence, replacing the disorganization that capitalism encourages with a disciplined, united force. With consciousness comes the ability to identify common goals, articulate demand, and mobilize in ways that confront the ruling class with real power. This organization is not spontaneous. It is cultivated through struggle, experience, and education, each reinforcing the understanding that collective action is the only path to liberation. As consciousness grows, it also expands the imagination of the working class. Workers begin to see that the world they inherit is not the world they must accept. They recognize that production can be organized around human need rather than private profit, that society can be structured around equality rather than hierarchy, and that democratic control over the economy is both possible and necessary. Class consciousness, therefore, does more than reveal oppression. It reveals possibility. It shows workers that they are not only victims of the system, but the agents capable of transforming it. When they see themselves as the creators of society's wealth, they begin to envision themselves as the creators of a new social order. Ultimately, class consciousness turns isolated individuals into a united, revolutionary force, because it reveals both the common oppression and the common power of the working class. It dissolves the false divisions that capitalism imposes and replaces them with a sense of shared struggle and shared destiny. When workers awaken to their collective identity, they cease to be scattered individuals and become a class capable of shaking the foundations of the system that exploits them. Through consciousness, the working class discovers its strength, its purpose, and its historic role as the force capable of transforming society from the ground up. Only organized, collective action by workers can overthrow capitalism and build a new social order, because no individual effort, no isolated protest, and no personal awakening can dismantle a system designed to absorb and neutralize resistance, unless that resistance takes the form of a united class force. Capitalism is not maintained merely through economic extraction, but through the institution, laws, ideologies, and social relations that reinforce the power of the ruling class. The worker who acts alone faces the full weight of this system, while the worker who acts collectively stands within a force capable of confronting it. Organization transforms scattered grievances into a coherent challenge, giving direction to anger, structure to discontent, and strategic power to those who seek transformation. Without collective action, the system continues to isolate and defeat individuals one by one, making resistance appear futile even when millions suffer from the same exploitation. The necessity of organization comes from the nature of capitalist production itself. Workers are placed in positions where they must sell their labor power to survive, and this dependence is used to discipline them, threaten them, and keep them obedient. As long as each worker faces the capitalist alone, the employer holds almost all of the leverage. But when workers come together, whether in workplaces, industries, community, or across entire nations, the balance shifts dramatically. A single worker can be replaced, but an entire workforce cannot be ignored. Collective action reveals the structural power of the working class, the ability to stop production, interrupt circulation, and challenge the flow of profit that capitalism depends upon. No ruling class can endure when those whose labor sustains society act in unity to withdraw consent from a system that exploits them. Organization also provides clarity of purpose. Workers may feel the daily pressures of exploitation, but without a collective framework, these experiences remain fragmented and difficult to interpret. Isolated struggles appear as personal hardships rather than symptoms of a system designed to benefit a minority. Through collective organization, workers gain the ability to analyze their conditions, connect their experiences to broader patterns, and recognize that their suffering is not unique but shared. This shared understanding forms the basis of class consciousness, which gives workers the intellectual and strategic tools necessary to confront capitalism as a system rather than as a series of individual injustices. Organization transforms confusion into insight, and insight into coordinated action. Collective action is also essential because capitalism adapts to individual resistance with ease but falters when facing collective demands. A single complaint can be ignored, a single protest can be dismissed, a single dissident can be fired or silenced. But when workers act together, they create a power that cannot easily be co-opted or repressed without significant consequences. Strikes, mass withdrawals of labor, coordinated campaigns, and organized movement exert pressure not on the margins of the system but at its core. They challenge the control of capital over production, distribution, and the political institutions that defend it. The ruling class understands this, which is why they fear worker organization more than anything else. They fear unions, councils, assemblies, and any collective structure through which workers can articulate their interests and exercise their power. Furthermore, only organized collective action can begin to build the foundations of a new social order. Overthrowing capitalism is not simply about ending exploitation. It is about constructing a system in which workers themselves control the means of production and direct economic life according to human need. This requires structures, leadership, democratic decision-making, and coordination that cannot arise spontaneously or through individual effort alone. Workers must learn to manage, plan, and operate society collectively. They must develop institutions capable of replacing those of capitalism. Organization is the training ground for this transformation, allowing workers to practice solidarity, cooperation, and shared governance. It is through collective action that workers acquire the skills and habits necessary to build a society where power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a few but distributed among the many. Collective action also provides protection. A worker acting alone is vulnerable to retaliation, but when workers move together, they shield one another from repression. Solidarity ensures that no worker stands alone in the struggle, and this mutual protection strengthens the resolve needed to confront a powerful ruling class. In unity, workers find courage, and in courage they find the strength to push forward despite the costs and risks involved. Ultimately, only organized, collective action by workers can overthrow capitalism and build a new social order, because only such action embodies the very principles of cooperation, equality, and shared power that must form the foundation of that new society. Capitalism relies on isolation, competition, and hierarchy, the movement that seeks. To replace, it must rely on solidarity, unity, and collective decision-making. The working class becomes capable of transforming society not simply by resisting exploitation but by organizing itself into a force capable of shaping the future. Through organization, workers move from being victims of the system to architects of a new world built upon justice, dignity, and collective liberation. In the end, everything returns to the simple, undeniable truth that has echoed through every struggle, every uprising, every moment when ordinary people realize the extraordinary power they hold. The working class is not a passive force shaped by history, but the active maker of it. The class whose labor builds the world and whose consciousness can transform it. Capitalism thrives only as long as workers remain divided, isolated, and unaware of their own strength. But when the veil lifts, when workers recognize that exploitation is not an individual fate but a shared condition, that their collective power can halt production and redirect the course of society, the foundations of the old order begin to tremble. The divisions imposed upon workers dissolve the moment they understand they have more in common with each other than with the ruling class that extracts their labor. The scattered struggles born of daily hardship become a unified movement once class consciousness takes root. And in that unity, the working class discovers the capacity not merely to resist exploitation, but to construct a new social order grounded in equality, dignity, and democratic control over the conditions of life. The force that sustains the world becomes the force that can reshape it, not through isolated defiance, but through organized, collective action capable of confronting and overcoming the power of capital. The future does not belong to those who profit from the labor of others. It belongs to those who produce, who endure, who dream of a world where human life is valued above profit. When workers stand together, they do more than challenge the system. They reveal the possibility of a different kind of society, one in which freedom is not a slogan but a lived reality. The power to stop the world and start a new one has always been in the hands of the working class, waiting only to be claimed through unity, consciousness, and collective determination.